Welcome to the String Theory of the Unexplained. I'm your host, John Ventre. Our co-host is Fred Saluga, and today's guests are James Krug and Jason Geis, and we're going to be discussing the secret space program. Welcome to the episode.
So this episode is about the secret space program, and some of these theories are going to seem a little bit far out, and some of them might be, but for every single one there's enough evidence that at least makes you think. So have you guys heard about the possibility that not only is Mars habitable, but we already have people there?
Yeah.
Okay, so one of my interests overall is the habitability of Mars. So officially, the atmosphere is carbon dioxide, and it's only 1/150th as thick as Earth. So you couldn't go there and breathe without a spacesuit. Now, I assumed most of this has been proven and reproven time and time again when Mars will transit in front of another star. So when Mars is going by a background star, basically light from that background star will go through Mars's atmosphere on the way to Earth. It sucks out different wavelengths, and they can tell what the atmosphere is made of. This is the same way they find out what the atmospheres of extrasolar planets are like. So I assume this is how it had been done, and it had been proven time and time again. I can't find yet a single group of scientists that's actually done this. In fact, the main piece of evidence that Mars's atmosphere is thin, aside from the NASA Viking probes, comes the whole way back from a Harvard astronomer you guys might recognize, Donald Menzel. Have you guys heard of Donald Menzel?
Yeah.
So Majestic 12, when they're looking over the list of the 12 men, they're shocked because they see Menzel on it, and he's an extreme skeptic, and they think, why is this guy in the group? But then they think, what if the government has one noted scientist that's a skeptic, sort of as the face of skepticism that's actually involved? So I looked, and way back in, I want to say about the 19-teens, Menzel wrote a paper on the atmosphere of Mars. And his whole reasoning, and there's a lot of math in the paper, I've read it, is he compared the color of rocks on Mars with the color of rocks in deserts here on the Earth. And he reasoned that for the Mars rocks to look the way they do, the atmosphere should be very, very thin. And that was it. That's where we have the majority of our evidence on Mars's atmosphere. Now, what's interesting is when NASA lands the Viking probes there in 1976, this is Viking 1, Viking 2, the original pictures that they send back show a blue sky just like they do on Earth. Well, then NASA claimed that they had made a mistake with that, and so they color corrected it to the red sky that we see today. People even said at Mission Control for these missions, there's actually a man going around to each computer terminal and changing the color contrast to make it look like a red sky instead of a blue. And now, the more recent pictures coming out from NASA are once again starting to show a blue sky, so some people wonder. One other interesting thing from those Viking missions, did you guys know that the original Viking probes had experiments on them to look for life, and they actually came back positive?
No.
So this is phenomenal. They had an experiment on them where basically the probe would inject a little bit of Martian soil with water, and it would look for trace methane coming back, because methane is a byproduct of microbial life.
Okay.
And all of the hits came back positive. And so the scientists were very excited. And then NASA came out later and said, no, this is a mistake. This was just some inorganic process. Well, interestingly, the team of scientists that made that experiment to this day says, yes, that worked right. There really was life. And curiously, you would think if NASA had this on the Viking probes, they would retry it again on future missions. And they've never retried this experiment since. So, in a roundabout way, that leads me to humans on Mars. I don't know if you guys have noticed, but whenever I read these stories about secret Mars colonists, one thing that's fascinating to me is they never describe needing spacesuits. They say they're just on Mars and that they can just breathe there, and I find that kind of interesting. So, I have a couple different cases for you guys about people that said they were a part of secret Mars missions. So, one woman came out and called into Coast to Coast AM. This was a few years ago. She identified herself as Jackie, and she said that she was part of the support team at Mission Control during one of the Viking missions. And she said that they were looking at a live feed from one of the Viking space probes that had landed there. And she actually watched men coming up to it. And she said they weren't even in spacesuits. She said they were in military suits. But they came up to it and started to service the space probe. And so from their support room, they just ran upstairs to the main room in Mission Control. And she said that NASA taped paper over the windows and locked the doors so they couldn't get in. Now, skeptically, some people have said her story has to be a lie because the Viking probes had the ability to take photographs, but they supposedly did not have live video equipment. But this opens up a whole can of worms because then people ask, are there people on Mars? Or is some of this footage shot here in one of NASA's rover test facilities, like what they have up in Canada, and that's just what that woman was seeing?
But you see what happens when they tamper with something like the sky color, you know, because this is what was expected. Now you create conspiracies.
You do.
And then you don't know what to believe. You don't know which is true. So what is the real atmosphere?
Now you had said that with the pictures, they had made a mistake. What was their mistake that they did you find?
Well, it's really interesting because NASA said they had not color corrected it properly. Now, the interesting thing is we assume that from these space probes we're getting back full color pictures, and we're not. They actually send it in different components, and then it's up to NASA to combine them to make a color picture. Now, curiously, there was at least one university, if not two, that had analyzed some of NASA's photographs, and they had concluded that for some reason NASA was increasing the red levels and decreasing the blue levels of what was seen on Mars. And one last thing about this, on a lot of these NASA space probes, when the probe can take a selfie of itself, it actually takes a picture of a little color panel. So the colors are known here on Earth. They'll put up red, green, blue, and NASA sees how the color changes there, and they know how to readjust it for Earth. But it looks like there's been tampering because in some of these pictures, they'll look at the color palette and the colors won't be remotely correct. The blue will become a bright pink, the red will become a purple. And so people are asking, are they actually tampering with this? So on to the actual Mars missions. There was footage that came out a couple years ago, very similar to the rumored secret Apollo 20 moon mission that was from supposedly Project Red Sun. Have you guys heard of Project Red Sun?
No, I have not.
So kind of a cool little bit of urban legend. This is supposedly right after Apollo 11 lands on the moon. There was a secret mission to Mars that contained Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and another astronaut a lot of people haven't heard of named Elliot C. Now, I've looked at the footage and I tend to think it's probably just a good hoax for a couple reasons. According to the legend, they just used a Saturn V rocket, which got the astronauts to the moon. Now, the moon's only 4 days away. Mars is a good 4 months away. So it seems unlikely they could have that kind of life support. Secondly, they said this actually happened when Armstrong and Aldrin and Michael Collins were on a worldwide tour for Apollo 11, so they were clearly here. Then on top of that, Elliot C. actually never got to fly in space on the Apollo missions because he actually died in 1966 in a training crash. So it does seem like just probably a good hoax, but there's some really cool footage online of what looked like Neil and Buzz in Apollo spacesuits, but then it's red and actually they're on the surface of Mars. So that's called Project Red Sun. But we have a lot of whistleblowers that have come out. Have you guys heard anything about Andrew Basiago or Laura Eisenhower? Yeah, what's the deal with them?
Well, Basiago, he spoke at the symposium last year in Vegas, the MUFON symposium. He claims to have been to Mars, and it was something like a 20-year trip, and he didn't age, or they regressed him, or did something. Now, Laura is, what, the granddaughter of
Dwight Eisenhower.
Dwight? I don't really know a lot about her. It's actually somebody we may get to speak, because we've had almost everybody, so.
Well, and interestingly, they all tell a very similar story that as children, they were basically picked out and selected, taken to Mars, and then there's one man named Michael Relf. This is where they get the phrase 20 and back. He has an even more extraordinary claim. He says he was taken to Mars as a child. He was trained in security, worked security there for 20 years, then was sent back to Earth and age regressed somehow to his original age. So to people from the outside, it was basically like he never left. So his world line would basically be like this, and it would go back to his same point. And so one of the curious things is they all tell a very similar story, that there is a U.S. base on Mars. It's highly classified. You can breathe the air on Mars. And Eisenhower and Basiago actually implicated a young President Obama in this. Have you guys heard about this?
Yeah, he said that. Yeah.
And so one of the dangers, let's say you're making a hoax, one of the dangers with incorporating somebody real, it can add to the credibility, but people that are well known, it's a lot easier to find a contradiction where it couldn't be. And curiously, during the time they said Obama was there, he was actually studying at a college in California. And so he would have been at the exact place where these people said this program was conducted from. One thing that's amazing, even though this sounds like a National Enquirer headline, this came out when Obama was in office. The White House actually officially commented, and they said, no, President Obama has not been involved in any secret space program. But I thought that was kind of interesting that they actually commented on it rather than ignore it.
But they don't know where he was. You don't have none of his records from nowhere.
Yeah. And he's the most dismissive president of all of them. When you ask him about life in space and space travel, he don't even give it a possibility. He just wants to know are they Democrats or Republicans, is which way to go to vote.
I mean, so,
but he's very dismissive.
Yeah, I mean, everything about him is unknown.
Well,
I mean, really, where was he born?
Right, and
who was his dad?
It makes an interesting twist, though, on the birther issue, because the big political debate is basically, well, they don't want to say because he was not actually born in the United States. But this makes a different twist on it. Maybe his past is covered up because he is actually part of this highly classified program. So
that's very true.
Now,
I mean,
whenever in your research or whenever you heard him speak, how were they chosen? What made these kids chosen, and like
they said
over someone else?
He said one criteria is that a lot of them were children of military families that were already working on classified programs. So I don't really know if there's a scenario where it's just orphans taken off the street, but
that's what
didn't de Blasio say too that Bush was up there?
he said that Bush and Cheney.
Yeah, there
he
was
said,
two presidents, and there was going to be a third president that was picked from that group up there. And he's the only other one.
Basically, the premise, it almost sounds like right out of Star Trek. I know you guys are big Star Trek fans, but it's interesting how many times Star Trek has been able to accurately predict the future.
Yeah.
So in Star Trek, you have teleportation, and according to all the whistleblowers in this program, it's not traditional chemical rocket technology. They're actually going to what they call jump rooms, and they're basically being instantaneously transported there. And again, these are technologies the United States has had an interest in since the 1950s, and we assume that they haven't made any progress, but there's a chance they may have. Anybody have anything else on Mars before we talk about Solar Warden?
No.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. So what gives a lot of these secret programs credence is the discovery of a Scottish computer hacker named Gary McKinnon in 2002 of a secret program called Solar Warden. Have you guys heard about this?
Yeah. Cool. You know, they had him at the symposium in Vegas, Fred, and I was expecting him to really tell us the background and the dirt. No, he really said very little.
Really?
I was disappointed at how little he said. He just basically said how it occurred. I'm sorry, and they didn't prosecute me. You know, he didn't.
Well, that might be why he didn't go.
Yeah.
Maybe they told him you can't.
If he talks too much, he's going to be going to jail for many
This is all you
years.
can say now.
So McKinnon is a brilliant hacker, and so he is autistic, and like a lot of people with autism, he has very strong gifts in some areas. And in 2002, over a 13-month period, he supposedly perpetrated the biggest computer hack of all time. So he went into U.S. and NASA computers, and he found a couple interesting things. He found evidence of a secret space program called Solar Warden, and he found Excel files that had lists of crews on different ships. So it would be like the USS so-and-so, but he didn't recognize it with any ship names that were actually here in the Navy. And he saw lists of ship-to-ship transfers of non-terrestrial officers. And he said in some NASA computers, he even found two separate files where one had pictures from our upper atmosphere showing UFOs, and then the second file were the same exact pictures, but they were airbrushed out. Now, the frustrating thing about his claims, McKinnon does not save any of it, because in his own testimony, he said, I wasn't interested in proving it to the world. I just wanted to figure it out for myself. And so he's initially caught at this, and you probably think that this guy's probably rotting away in jail somewhere, but he ends up not facing trial. The U.S. threatened to extradite him for years, but the reason they didn't put him on trial is his defense lawyers would have been able to call U.S. officials to the stand and ask them questions on the record about UFOs. And just one quick side thing to it, he had seen evidence that the U.S. as part of Solar Warden had upwards of 6 or 8 large cigar-shaped ships, and then something like 40 circular smaller scout ships. And interestingly, if you look back in the memoirs of Ronald Reagan, he actually refers in his memoirs of meeting one of his national security advisors and being stunned that we had the ability to have 300 people in space at a time.
Yeah.
And at the time, there was only 5 or 6 space shuttles. So
Yeah,
even if you
8
max them
people,
out,
so
right?
that's
Exactly.
right.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's quite a lot of evidence to back up that Solar Warden could actually be real.
Now, did you find anything, or do you know anything if with these different programs, is it just the United States thing? Was there anything like, are we working with, England and or
A lot of people say
is there
we
any,
actually work
allied
with Russia.
spaceship or
Yeah,
Yeah.
Russia,
We
Yeah.
actually work with
yeah,
them.
that's what I was
Yep.
just
One of my best Area 51 stories that I've heard doesn't even involve aliens. A person was taken there, and they were shown a secure room where they said scientists from all around the world were working together,
Right.
and they had translators to overcome all the language barriers. And I think to myself, sometimes they refer to a breakaway civilization. I think, what if all this stuff we see on TV with all the politics and all the countries fighting each other, what if that's really just there to distract us? And at the
What is it?
highest levels, people have even said that about the space program, that the United States and Soviet Union early on were not truly in a space race against each other.
Right.
They realized the extent of the situation, they were working together. So
Yeah.
I think it almost makes for a happy ending that at the highest levels we can put aside our differences and work together. So yeah, I've heard that exactly.
And who was played? The 7 billion people who played for fools.
Right.
But how could you have a Cold War and they're actually working on the space
Well, it's like
program
having
together?
NASA,
Yeah.
but also having the Air Force's space program
Yeah.
that's funded higher
Yeah.
than NASA, and
Yeah.
NASA's the space people, right? But
Yeah.
yet the Air Force's program gets more than the 9 billion.
And that's a great point, because a lot of people don't realize there were secret astronauts, and that's been proven. So as John said, while NASA was going, the Air Force had their own space program. And what they were going to use it for initially is interesting. It was going to be a spy program. This was before spy satellites. They were going to put up what was called the Gemini Manned Orbiting Laboratory. It was going to be like a 2-man Gemini capsule that NASA flew, but it was going to have a big piece on the back. And so these secret space astronauts were going to go to the windows and take pictures of military installations as it orbited. And this was actually going to have the first ever African-American astronaut. His name was Major Bob Lawrence. He was going to go up decades before Guion Bluford ends up doing it for the United States. But the sad thing that happened is, over about a 5-year period, automated spy satellite technology got so good that they decided they no longer needed to put men in space.
What year was
So
it?
this would have been mid-60s, so like 1966. And so officially, if you look these
Pittsburgh.
guys up, they're called the Astro Spies, and officially the program was axed. But as John said, the U.S. Air Force space program is still to this day better funded than NASA is.
Do you touch on the X-37B, the drone space shuttle? Because that's all part of this program too. And I remember it was December of 2012. I'm just watching television, right? And they show a drone space shuttle. It's smaller. It might be the size of this room as compared to being, whatever, 70 feet long. They show it landing on an aircraft carrier. And then if you look it up, it was in space for over 2 years. It was launched in
Yeah, I remember that,
2010,
yeah.
came back in 2012.
Yeah.
That's part of the secret space program, and why Obama shut down the space shuttle program when he challenged NASA to be bigger and bolder. He knew we already had drones out there. Well, where was it for 2 years?
Right.
Mars? I don't know.
Officially, it was in Earth orbit, but even when I see things like that on TV, I think if they're showing us that, there's got to be
That's
something
right,
even way
exactly,
better
yeah.
than that
Oh,
out
yeah.
there.
And they only show you that when they're pretty much done with that and moved on to something else. And it goes right over everyone's head.
Yep.
Nobody made an issue of it. It's amazing how people are.
Or even just recently, I don't know if you guys saw, we had President Trump talking officially about we need to have a space force.
Yeah.
So some people think he knows there is one there, and this is the first step to getting out. But the other thing that's very curious is, we had only talked about Mars so far, but did you see NASA just canceled the only mission we actually have going to the moon right now, which was a moon rover? So the Soviets have had rovers on the moon. China officially had one. We've never had one there. And even though President Trump, when he took over from Obama, he redirected the focus of the space program from Mars back to the moon, which I think is good, we just canceled the only actual moon program we have going right now. So some people think, I personally think, what if we're intentionally being stalled when it comes to the moon and Mars? Because behind the scenes in the secret space program, we're already way ahead here.
Well,
So
what's his name said, though? What, Rich?
I have the quote right here.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Can I read the quote?
Yeah,
Or do you-
yeah.
So this is from Lockheed Martin Skunk Works Ben Rich. So this was a guy that really knew his stuff. He said, "We already have the means to travel among the stars, but these technologies are locked up in black projects, and it would take an act of God to ever get them out to benefit humanity. Anything you can imagine, we already know how to do." And that's right from the mouth of the head of Lockheed
And
Martin
Jan
Skunk Works.
Harzan actually was at the presentation when he said that.
Really?
Yeah, years ago. What year was that? Does it say 93, whatever he had
It
said
would have been 90s,
Yeah,
yeah.
he was actually in the audience, and he then, when it broke up, he walked up to him with somebody else, and he said, "Do you realize what you just said?" And,
Yeah.
and he couldn't go into depth on it, but that's what he said.
Wow. Let me ask you guys, how likely do you think it is if we have anti-gravity technology, it's actually an extension of what the Nazis were working on at the end of World War II? Because officially, they had the V1 and the V2. The V2 rocket leads to our own space program when we bring those Nazis here.
Yeah.
But there were always rumors of the Vril program,
Right.
which was circular spaceships,
Right.
and then the Nazi Bell, which people think if it was real was either a time machine or like a UFO like
Right.
what we have today. How likely do you guys think it is, because I know you know a lot about Kecksburg,
Yeah.
that if we do have this stuff today, it's because the Nazis at least had the idea and then we brought it here?
Well, in the last book I just published last Friday, The String Theory of the Unexplained, I give a lot of alternative theories to what people believe about UFOs, but there was a crash in the Black Forest in 1936. That's what got Hitler started, and I believe that was a real UFO crash. But the Roswell stuff was that Nazi stuff we got in 1945, Project Paperclip, that we tested and crashed in Roswell. And that starts that whole thing going. But it was based on a real UFO. But I think 90% of a lot of the stuff, there are experiments and stuff. They're not really from space.
Well, interestingly, as early as the 1950s, the United States government was buying out patents from scientists who were making progress in anti-gravity. So sometimes I wonder myself, what if NASA is the public front, where basically
Yeah.
they're told, look, you guys have chemical rockets, you can do as much as you can with chemical rockets, but this is the propulsion that you use. Then behind the scenes, they're using the anti-gravity
Yeah,
propulsion.
I absolutely think
Yeah,
that stuff
I
goes on.
agree,
you
Yeah.
know.
One last thing I want to get your opinions on. Have you ever noticed in so many of the mysterious plane crashes today, like we had MH370 over Malaysia, how many of those airplanes are filled with a bunch of very quality scientists and engineers?
Yeah.
So sometimes people ask, well, if this program is really going on, where are they getting all the people from? How are they disappearing? Well, it seems like in some of these controversial crashes, you're losing entire plane loads of people all at once.
And in the Malaysia 370, they were all on the plane, and then when it disappeared or crashed, they lost their rights to what they were working on, and it went back to the company.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
Which makes you
Wow.
believe it was
Yeah.
taken down, taken
Mhm.
out,
Mhm.
you know?
Well, and then what Fred mentioned in the last one is the amount of missing people in the world each year is just frightening. I think in the United States alone, it gets upwards of 250,000 children a year. Now, I looked into it because I thought that would be an epidemic. How's that possible? And some of it, they said, was custody disputes,
it's
runaways.
parents.
Right.
Yeah.
But there's still a number of people that just sort of
Just
disappear
disappear.
every year.
I
and we
think
don't
it
know.
actually, when you eliminate all of that, it's 40,000 people a year
Wow.
are never found.
Wow.
40,000.
Wow.
What's interesting, when you read Pilates books,
Mm-hmm.
I don't think you got too many people over 27 years old. Everybody in them books is under 27.
That's interesting.
You know, and you know, you got a mixture of children and that age. That's the age it's supposed to be going to Mars.
Well,
we're
that's what I'm
safe.
saying. With the
I
Mars
believe it.
with the Mars thing that you were talking about earlier, that's why I was asking, like, thinking line of all these kids, like if they had said that it was like they were selected or they just randomly picking people, and yeah, they're, like they're now serving your time on Mars, doing whatever, which is very
In a way, it would be a real positive for humanity, because if we truly become a multi-planet species, our chances of going extinct really drop down. So
Right.
if something catastrophic happens
Right,
here, but it's still a little unnerving. One last thing I thought about. Have you guys heard, Jay, I know you know about it, Alternative 3?
No.
it's very,
Oh, it dovetails real nicely. Do you want to take that one,
Let him
Alternative
do
3?
the
All right,
talking.
from the
Yeah,
little
yeah.
bit that I remember filling in, Alternative 3 was essentially officially it was a piece of fiction that was put out in the BBC as like kind of like a docudrama, and the whole idea was with overcrowding and whatever that there's some elites that were good. There were alternatives how to deal with the way things were going on planet Earth, and the first alternative was alternative 1 was to do nothing and not care.
I think alternative 1 was it was either that or it was set off nuclear weapons in the atmosphere to blow holes in it to let the heat out.
To let the heat out.
Yeah.
Or whatever. I forget what alternative 2 was, but
Alternative
That
2
was
was
like
going
heat out. I think
underground.
would
Yeah.
that,
Well,
like,
that was the idea. I mean,
They tried it though in Project. If you heard of Project Starfish Prime,
Yeah.
they tried back in the late 50s to blow holes in the Van Allen belts, those zones of radiation around Earth,
Yeah.
in preparation for a moon mission, and it backfired. The weapon blowing up in space actually made a third Van Allen belt, so they did try it. Go ahead, Jason.
And then alternative 3 was essentially to load people up on spaceships and go out into space, and and so it was released on BBC, and officially it was people got really upset and worked up about it. And I mean, from my knowledge, is the official word, we were just making it up, and it's never been aired again. It's like really hard to find. Like,
Right.
So it's real.
I tried to find it on YouTube because I'm like, what sounds like I like science fiction stuff.
Yeah,
It sounds interesting. I've not been able to actually see the actual project or the thing. That's the little bit I know.
No, that's good. And interestingly, the only thing I wanted to add, the man who wrote it said right after that he received a lot of calls and a lot of inquiries from some high-ranking military officials. And he initially was going to write a follow-up to it, and he never did because his belief was totally inadvertently he had gotten very, very close to the roots of a real program that was actually going on. John, did you want to talk about Project Serpo, or do you want to save that for a future?
No, do it. We got time. Do Serpo.
Do you want to start off with Serpo?
Yeah.
You sure?
Yeah.
So Serpo was a series, and you can still go to the website, of official press releases on a secret exchange program that the United States had with another alien civilization. And this...
Similar to the end of Close Encounters, sort of.
Very, very
Yeah,
similar
yeah,
to that.
yeah.
Yeah, some people actually think Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind, that the ending actually showed the real exchange from Project Serpo.
Okay.
And I had read up on Close Encounters how they filmed that. They said it was a very high level of secrecy. They said even the actors were only given the script little pieces at a time. So you're right. So the basic gist, back in 2005, a user named Anonymous starts posting to an email discussion group led by a man named Victor Martinez. And this ends up leading to 76 total disclosures from this source. And so supposedly this was the Eben civilization. They were the rumored abductors of Betty and Barney Hill. And so they came, I believe, from the Zeta Reticuli star system, which is 40 light years away. And they supposedly set up an exchange with the United States. We received 1 or 2 of their ambassadors. This is where the alleged J-Rod extraterrestrial comes in. And then we sent 12 humans to planet Serpo, which is in the Zeta Reticuli system, for so many years to actually study there. So it makes for a phenomenal story, but at the same time, there's a lot of questions about it. There are countless press releases, but even though this crew supposedly took thousands of rolls of film with them, there's only been a handful of pictures that have ever been posted, and they seem somewhat hoaxed. And there's just a lot of questions about if President Kennedy really knew about this, if President Reagan knew about it. So there's a lot of interesting tie-ins, but...
Len Kasten wrote a book on it, Project Serpo. I had read that years ago. But I think one of the things that makes me suspicious, though, is they said that the Roswell aliens were part of this group, and part of it was that exchange program was to get the bodies back and the one that was still living.
Right.
So I'm saying to myself, do I want to be part of the 12, right? Because they picked people that had no siblings, they were only children. or their parents had already passed away, so they were alone in the military, let's say. So now you're very expendable,
Right.
right? Now, do I want to be one of the 12 that goes there in exchange for one,
Right.
knowing that they're giving back 2 autopsied bodies that they're not going to be happy about? I don't think I want to be part of that 12. And then right off the bat, one died in the trip,
Yeah.
another one died in a confrontation with them. There was stuff that went wrong with that 12, supposedly based on his book. I don't think I'd want to be 12 for one when we're giving them back 2 bodies we cut open.
One thing that always sticks in my mind with that story is just one of those details that is good to add, like, oh, this because this really happened as far as details, but also seems like too true, too good to be true. Is there's a story told of how some of the astronauts or the exchange program people were teaching them the game of baseball. And they actually, like, they packed it, like, so, you're going to another planet, and you made sure you brought your baseball equipment, because we were going to teach these aliens baseball, and the aliens didn't take to it much. But I always thought that was one of those things that, are you just trying to make this seem like very Hollywood as far as not believing it, or it's just weird enough that maybe it is true that, like, during the time we spent some time trying to show them games that we
Right, the very human element.
They personalize
Yeah. It's like,
It is interesting how many famous UFO cases it relates to. Like, you all know about the Officer Lonnie Zamora sighting from 1964. It's considered pretty credible. Some people think that that was supposed to be the meetup of the extraterrestrials with the humans, but they got the coordinates wrong. So,
location. Okay.
I don't know. I can see it both ways. My one issue is, let's say the star system really is 40 light years away. For you to communicate with them should theoretically take 80 years. 40 years for the radio signal to go out, 40 years for it to come back. But in this legend, they supposedly figured out some type of faster than light communication. Now, I almost wouldn't believe it, but do you remember the Serpo graphic novel? They made a graphic novel of this, which was basically a comic book summation of these 70-some things. And supposedly, the author and writer of this graphic novel was actually able to track down one of the real men that was on board. And he went to interview him. The man lived outside D.C., and it was all set up, and he got to the man's house, and he said his wife came out with her arms crossed and said, "You can't talk to my husband." And then he looked right down the street, and supposedly there was a car of government men sitting there. So kind of a neat twist on the story at the end there.
Yeah. It's all interesting,
Yeah.
So, but you look at some more now, there's a college out there said that they did this.
Yeah, the kids said that they pranked it to
they
college.
pranked
kids.
it.
Really?
I
never heard that
I don't
one.
believe it.
Yeah, I'm not-
I
I
don't
don't
believe
believe
it.
It's the same thing now with Ravenna. Kent State students said that they actually were the ones that ran the UFO that they chased into Pennsylvania.
Well, you know, some of those things are true, but some things like the whole crop circle thing, the media initially in the early 80s was very interested in that, but then they had those 2 British guys come out. Was it Dan and Dave?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
Doug and Dave.
Doug and
Yeah.
Dave, and they showed how they hoaxed one using
Yeah.
a 2x4 and some
Yeah.
rope. And then as far as the media was concerned, that was all crop circles, was
But they
that.
didn't hoax it in every country.
Right,
Exactly.
And then
right.
they kept doing it even after they died.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
so we have crop circle ghosts. So, all right, is that everything? In
Yeah,
there?
that's about it.
that's
Secret
all
space
cool
program.
Stuff. Yeah, so very good. Thank you.
Thanks.
That sounds good. Thanks.